At the 42nd floor birthday party, my daughter-in-law sneered at me before thousands of live stream viewers. "Don't touch the food. This room costs more than you earned in 5 years, you peasant." My own son nodded. "She's right, you're embarrassing us." I silently set down the spoon. Minutes later, the manager carried the bill to the table. The account holder revoked the payment authorization. "Your outstanding balance is $15,000. Every face in that room went pale. You are watching Dad as Revenge Stories. Thank you deeply for spending your time here. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your country or city in the comments to join our community. Also keep in mind, this account includes fictional elements for entertainment and education. Any similarity to names or settings is coincidental, but the lesson shared is meant to be useful. My name is Raymond Calloway, and I am 67 years old. The suit has been hanging in the same corner of my closet for 11 years. Dark navy single button, the lining frayed at the left cuff, where I caught it on a fence post, the winter I wore it to my brother Frank's retirement dinner. Margaret had said I should throw it out after that. I told her the suit still had good years left in it. That was the kind of argument we had in those days, small forgettable, the sort that dissolves before breakfast. I won that one. Tonight, I was glad I did. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and worked the knot of my tie 3 times before I got it right. My hands, even after 2 years away from the farm, still carried the thickness of 40 years of physical work, knuckles wide palms calloused in the places where a shovel handle sits. No amount of retirement softened that. Clara used to press her small hand against mine when she was a girl and say, "Daddy, your hands feel like tree bark." I told her tree bark was what held everything together. She thought about that for a long time before she nodded. I thought about her now as I straightened my collar. She had called me at 5:30, her voice tight, in that particular way she had when she was trying to sound calmer than she felt. "Dad, I have a bad feeling about tonight." "You've had bad feelings before," I said. "And I've been right before," she said back. I could not argue with that. Clara had her mother's eyes and her grandmother Dorothy's instincts, and between those two things she had never once been wrong about people. I told her to bring her friend Nadia and to sit somewhere with a clear view of the room. She asked me why. I told her it was better to have something recorded and never need it than to need it and have nothing. She went quiet for a moment, then said, "Dad, what exactly are you planning?" "Nothing," I told her. "I'm just making sure the truth has a witness." I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet the way a house gets quiet when only one person is left moving through it. Margaret had left 2 hours earlier to go to the salon, then directly to the Meridian, with Preston and Vanessa. She had knocked on my bedroom door before leaving and said through the wood, "Don't be late, Raymond." Not "Are you all right?" Not "Do you need anything?" Just "Don't be late." I had stared at the door for a moment after I heard her footsteps move away down the hall, and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sadness. It was something older and quieter than either of those. It was the feeling of a man who has spent decades being practical about things that deserved more than practicality. I had not always been this way. There was a version of me a long time ago who drove 3 hours in a February snowstorm to bring Margaret wildflowers from the only greenhouse still open in February because she had mentioned once offhandedly that she missed color in the winter. She had cried when she saw them. Preston was 2 years old, then asleep in the back seat the whole drive. Clara had not yet been born. Back then, the distance between what I felt and what I showed was much smaller. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. The family group chat had 42 unread messages. I did not open it. I already knew what was in there. Vanessa had been posting since noon outfit photos, countdown timers, a video of herself saying, "So excited to celebrate my father-in-law tonight. This evening is going to be absolutely stunning." And yes, I put every bit of it together myself. The comments beneath each post were full of flame emojis and exclamation points from people I had never met. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and left it there. The walk to the Meridian was 22 blocks. I know most people would have called a car. I walked because walking was the one thing in my life that had always belonged entirely to me. On the farm, I walked the fence line every morning before sunrise, checking posts, checking wire, just moving through the land with no purpose other than to know it was still there. It was the closest thing I had to prayer. Tonight, I needed that. I needed those 22 blocks to belong to nobody but me. It was August in New York City, and the heat came up from the pavement even at 7 in the evening, warm and thick, and smelling of asphalt and food carts, and the particular exhaust of 10,000 air conditioners all running at once. I passed a diner with its windows steamed up a bodega, where two men were arguing cheerfully about baseball. A woman walking a dog the size of a small horse who looked at me with complete indifference. The city moved the way it always moved, without waiting for anyone, without asking permission, without caring in the least about the private dramas taking place inside its buildings and its hearts. I found that comforting. 3 months earlier, I had walked these same blocks in this same suit to meet Scott Harper at the Meridian for the first time. I had paid the deposit in certified check and handed it across his desk and said, "I want this evening to feel like something my family will remember." Scott had looked at me at the suit, at the hands, at the man sitting across from him, and he had not once let his expression suggest that I looked out of place in his 42nd floor restaurant. He had simply said, "Mr. Calloway, we'll make sure of it." I had liked him immediately for that. I had also that same week visited attorney Miles Donovan on the 11th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue. Miles was the kind of lawyer who listened more than he spoke, which in my experience was the rarest and most valuable kind. I had revised my will, a legal document outlining how my assets would be distributed after my death, and I had made changes that Preston did not know about, and Vanessa would not like. That was a matter for another day. What mattered that evening was that Miles knew what I needed from him tonight, and he had agreed to attend the dinner as a guest. "As a friend," I had said. "As a friend," he had confirmed, "until you need me to be something else." I stopped at the corner of 54th and 6th and looked up. The Meridian rose above me, its upper floors catching the last orange light of the August sun. Somewhere up there on the 42nd floor, the room I had paid for was being set up, the flowers I had approved were being arranged, and the evening I had planned for 3 months was about to begin. I had kept a secret from my family for 3 months. Tonight, one way or another, it was going to come out. I straightened my tie one last time, feeling the rough edge of the frayed cuff against my wrist, and I walked through the front door. The elevator at the Meridian was the kind that moved without sound. No cables groaning, no shudder at each floor, just a smooth and silent rise through 42 stories of glass and steel. I stood alone inside it, watching the number above the doors climb, and I let myself do something I rarely permitted. I looked back. Not at tonight. Further than that. I met Margaret Ann Holloway in the spring of 1981 at a county fair in upstate New York, where I had entered a competition for best winter wheat, and she had come to photograph it for the local paper. She was 24 years old, and she had a laugh that carried across 3 livestock stalls. I won second place in the competition. I spent the prize money on 2 cups of lemonade and gave her one. We were married 14 months later in a white clapboard church outside of Ithaca, and I believed standing there at the altar with soil still worked into the creases of my knuckles despite 3 rounds of scrubbing that I was the luckiest man in the state of New York. For a long time I was not wrong. The farm sat on 68 acres of good flat land in Schuyler County. My father had worked it before me and his mother before him. The soil was dark and heavy and honest. It gave back exactly what you put into it. Nothing more, nothing less. I respected that about land. It never pretended. It never told you one thing and meant another. You planted in spring, you tended through summer, you harvested in fall, and if you had worked honestly, you ate well through winter. That was the whole of the agreement, and it never changed. Preston was born in 1986. Margaret cried when the nurse put him in her arms, and I stood beside the hospital bed with my hat in my hands, feeling something so large I had no word for it. I drove home that night through a light October rain and stood in the middle of the field for 20 minutes in the dark, just breathing. Clara came 4 years later, smaller and quieter, from the very first day, with eyes that watched everything and missed nothing. The difference in how Margaret loved them was not something she ever announced. It was something that accumulated the way weather accumulates slowly and then all at once. Preston was pulled onto her lap first. Preston's drawings went on the refrigerator. Preston's games were attended with the kind of full-body enthusiasm that left her hoarse the next morning. Clara's drawings went on the refrigerator too, but on the side panel near the hinge. Clara's recitals were attended, but Margaret sat with her phone face up on her knee. I told myself it was not intentional. I told myself Margaret simply responded more to volume, and Preston had always been louder. Clara seemed fine. Clara always seemed fine. That was the problem with a child who seemed fine. You stopped checking whether she actually was. When Preston brought Vanessa home for the first time in the fall of 2018. Margaret put on her good earrings before dinner. I noticed because she had not worn those earrings since Frank's retirement party. Vanessa arrived in a car that cost more than my first tractor, wearing heels that were entirely wrong for a farmhouse porch, and Margaret took one look at her and said, while I was still shaking Vanessa's hand, "Finally, someone who can bring some class to this family." She laughed when she said it, the way people laugh when they mean something but want the option of calling it a joke. I shook Vanessa's hand and smiled and said nothing. That was the first time I said nothing when I should have spoken. It was not the last. Over the next 5 years, I watched Vanessa absorb Margaret's attention, the way dry ground absorbs the first rain of spring completely, and immediately leaving nothing on the surface. Clara, who had driven 3 hours every month to help me manage the farm's accounting after my eyesight started going, who had sat with my mother Dorothy through 2 knee surgeries and a winter bout of pneumonia, who had fixed the broken gutter on the south side of the barn because she knew I could not get up on the ladder anymore. Clara became, in Margaret's telling of the family, the daughter who was too busy to visit much. I did not correct the record out loud. I corrected it in other ways. Quietly. The way I did most things. Then came January of 2024, and everything changed. The county had been planning the new highway bypass for 11 years. When the eminent domain notice finally arrived, eminent domain being the legal process by which the government acquires private land for public use, compensating the owner at fair market value. I was not surprised. I had been expecting it since the survey crews showed up on the eastern edge of my property in 2022. What surprised me was the number on the check, $1,240,000. I sat at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in January with a certified check in front of me and a cup of coffee going cold beside it, and I stared at that number for a long time. I thought about my father's hands. I thought about his mother's hands. I thought about the photograph on my wall of Dorothy standing beside the first tractor the family ever owned, 1962, her hair pinned back, squinting into the sun, with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that the world is going to cooperate with her whether it wants to or not. I did not call Margaret. I did not call Preston. I called Frank because Frank was the one person in my life who had never once told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. "Ray," Frank said when I told him the number. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to do something right," I said, "for the people who deserve it." Frank was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then it's about time. I had not told another soul about the money. I had opened a separate account, a new bank account entirely in my name, unconnected to the joint accounts Margaret and I shared, and I had transferred the full amount into it the same afternoon. I had then called Miles Donovan and made an appointment to revise my will, and I had called Scott Harper at the Meridian and made a reservation for 40 guests on the 14th of August. 2 weeks after that, Vanessa somehow knew. Vanessa had 340,000 followers on Instagram, and a personal brand she described in her own words as aspirational authenticity. I had to ask Clara what that meant. Clara thought about it for a moment and said, "It means she performs a real life instead of living one." I had not come up with a better definition since. My daughter-in-law had never held a salaried job in the 6 years she had been married to Preston. What she had was a ring light, a content calendar, and an instinct for standing in front of other people's work and making it look like hers. I do not say that with cruelty. I say it because it is the most accurate description I have. The anniversary party was the first time I understood the full scope of what she was capable of. Margaret and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary in June of 2022. Clara had spent 3 weeks designing the event hand-lettered place cards, a slideshow of photographs she had pulled from shoeboxes in my closet, and scanned herself a playlist of songs from the years Margaret and I had been young together. She drove up from the city the Wednesday before to set up, stayed through the weekend, and drove back Sunday night with flour on her jacket from the cake she had helped the caterer finish. She told me not to mention her name during the speeches. "It's your night, Dad," she said. "Just enjoy it." Vanessa arrived the afternoon of the party, took 47 photographs, and posted them before the dessert course was cleared. The caption read, "Spent weeks pulling this together for my in-laws' anniversary. Family is everything. So proud of what we created." The comments filled up instantly. Margaret's friends called Vanessa thoughtful, creative, devoted. Margaret herself reposted the story with a red heart. Clara saw the post from the kitchen, where she was helping stack chairs. She did not say anything. She stacked the chairs and drove home. I watched that happen, and I said nothing. That was my failure, not just Vanessa's. Dorothy was the one who finally gave me the language for what I had been watching. My mother was 83 years old and had lived through enough winters on that farm to know the difference between a person who worked and a person who photographed work. She had a bad hip and moved in a wheelchair now, but her mind was a steel trap that had never once rusted. One Sunday afternoon, after Vanessa had posted a story showing herself sitting beside Dorothy's hospital bed during Dorothy's second knee surgery, the caption said, "Caring for Grandma today, love this woman so much." Dorothy called me into her room, waited until the door was closed, and said, "Raymond, that girl was here for 11 minutes. She left before the doctor came. Clara sat with me until 9 o'clock at night, and then drove home in the dark." I sat down in the chair beside her bed. My chest felt tight in the way it got when something had been wrong for a long time, and you finally let yourself name it. "I know, Mom," I said. "No," Dorothy said, and her voice had that particular flatness it got when she was not asking for agreement, but delivering a verdict. "You know, and you stay quiet. That is a different thing, Raymond. That is a choice." She was right. I had watched Vanessa take credit for Clara's catering calls, Clara's logistics, Clara's hours of quiet labor, and I had told myself that Clara was strong enough to bear it, that it was not my place to intervene in the dynamics between the women in my family, that things would correct themselves eventually. None of those things were true. They were the comfortable stories a man tells himself when the alternative is a conversation he does not want to have. So when Vanessa stumbled onto my secret, I was not entirely surprised that she immediately turned it into something about herself. What happened was this. I had been using the shared family computer in the living room, an old desktop that Margaret and I had bought years ago, which Preston and Vanessa used when they visited to check my email. I had received a confirmation from the Meridian, with the subject line, "Reservation confirmed Preston Calloway, family celebration, August 14th. I had read it close the browser and forgotten to clear the history. I forgot because I was 67 years old and had not grown up in a world where forgetting to clear browser history had consequences. Vanessa visited the following Saturday. I was out back trimming the hedges. She used the computer for 20 minutes, and by the time I came inside, she was already on her phone, her eyes bright with the particular light they got when she believed something valuable had fallen into her lap. She did not say anything to me. She kissed Margaret on both cheeks, said the house looked wonderful, and left 40 minutes later. That evening, the family group chat erupted. "Everyone, I have the most exciting news about Dad's birthday celebration." Vanessa had written with a sequence of celebration emojis. "You are all so welcome in advance." 12 family members responded within the hour. Heart emojis, thank you notes, one cousin who wrote, "Vanessa, you are a queen." Preston added a thumbs up. Margaret wrote, "This is why we love you, sweetheart." My name did not appear in the thread once. I read every message sitting at my kitchen table, with my coffee going cold. Then I set the phone down, walked to the back porch, and stood in the dark for a while, listening to the city. I was not angry, exactly. Anger was too simple for what I felt. What I felt was a kind of tired clarity, the feeling of a man who has finally seen the whole picture and understands at last exactly what he is dealing with. I went back inside and called Scott Harper. "Scott," I said, "I need you to do something for me. Whatever requests come in from anyone other than me regarding this reservation, decline them all, and save every communication you receive." Scott paused for just a moment. "Understood, Mr. Calloway. Every communication." "Good," I said. "And Scott, thank you." I hung up and went to bed. 2 floors above me in the family group chat, Vanessa was still accepting congratulations for a party she had not planned for a room she had not booked for an evening built entirely on 40 years of a quiet man's quiet work. The first time I walked into the Meridian, I almost turned around at the door. Not because I was intimidated. I had negotiated land contracts with county officials, argued equipment prices, with suppliers who thought a farmer in work boots had no business sense, and buried my father on a Tuesday and driven a combine on Wednesday because the harvest did not wait for grief. I was not a man who frightened easily. What stopped me at the door of the Meridian was something simpler and more uncomfortable than fear. It was the sudden, sharp awareness that I was about to spend more money on a single evening than my parents had spent on anything in their entire lives combined. I stood on the sidewalk for 30 seconds. Then I thought about Dorothy standing beside that tractor in 1962, squinting into the sun. I thought about what she had said to me in the hospital room. "You know, and you stay quiet. That is a choice." I pushed open the door and walked in. Scott Harper met me in the lobby. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent his career making other people feel comfortable in rooms they were not sure they belonged in. He wore a dark suit and no tie, and when he shook my hand, he did not glance down at my work boots or at the frayed cuff of my jacket. He simply said, "Mr. Calloway, thank you for coming in. Shall we go up?" We took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The private dining room was empty that afternoon, chairs upturned on tables. The city spread out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, like something from a painting. Scott walked me through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who respected both his time and mine. He showed me where the tables would be arranged, where the bar cart would stand, where the small stage for the birthday remarks would be positioned. I asked about the flowers. He showed me 3 options. I chose the simplest one, white and pale yellow, nothing theatrical. "The package you selected," Scott said, setting a leather folder on the nearest table, "comes to $14,800 before gratuity and tax. With both, the final estimate is approximately $15,000. I had expected the number. I had run it in my head a dozen times on the walk over. Still, hearing it spoken aloud in a quiet room did something particular to my chest, not regret, but a kind of solemnity. $15,000. My father had bought the farm for less than that. "That's fine," I said. "I'll put down a certified check for the deposit today. The balance can go on my card after the event." Scott nodded and opened the folder to the contract. "And the name for the reservation. I had thought about this carefully. I had turned it over for 2 weeks, testing it from different angles, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. In the end, I had decided on Preston's name because I was still at that point hoping I was wrong about my son. I was still hoping that the man Preston had become was a temporary condition rather than a permanent one, that somewhere inside him was the 12-year-old boy who used to follow me along the fence line on Saturday mornings, asking questions about soil composition and weather patterns with an enthusiasm that had not yet been redirected toward easier things. "Preston Calloway," I said. "Family celebration." Scott wrote it down without comment. I signed the contract and wrote the deposit check, and Scott walked me to the elevator with the same unhurried courtesy he had shown from the beginning. At the doors, I stopped and said, "Scott, I need one thing from you that isn't in the contract." "Of course. Nobody is to know who's paying for this until I give you the signal. Not the staff, not any guests who ask, not anyone who calls or emails to make changes." I paused. "And if anyone does call or email to make changes, decline everything and save the communication." Scott looked at me for a moment, with an expression that told me he had seen enough of human nature in his career to understand, without further explanation, exactly what kind of situation I was describing. "Understood completely, Mr. Calloway," he said. "Everything goes through you, from the Meridian." I walked 6 blocks south to the building on Lexington Avenue, where Miles Donovan kept his office on the 11th floor. Miles was the estate planning attorney, a lawyer who specialized in wills trusts and the orderly transfer of assets, and he had handled my father's estate 20 years earlier with such careful thoroughness that I had never considered using anyone else for my own affairs. His office smelled like old paper and coffee, which I found reassuring. He listened without interrupting while I explained what I wanted. When I finished, he set down his pen and said, "Raymond, what you're describing is entirely within your rights. A person may revise their will at any time provided they are of sound mind and acting without coercion. You are clearly both." The changes were straightforward. The majority of my estate, the compensation money, my remaining savings, and any assets acquired going forward would pass to Clara outright. A defined portion would fund a scholarship in the name of the Calloway farm. Preston would receive a specific bequest, a legal term, for a fixed designated amount, enough to know he had not been forgotten, but not enough to excuse 40 years of choices. "And Margaret?" Miles asked. "Margaret will receive her spousal share," I said. Under New York law, a surviving spouse is entitled to claim 1/3 of the estate regardless of what the will specifies, what lawyers call the elective share. I've already spoken with a financial advisor about structuring the separation agreement, to address that cleanly. Miles nodded and made a note. Then he looked up. Is there anything else you need from me for this? I thought about the Meridian, about Scott Harper, about the evening I had been building in my head for 3 months. Yes, I said. I need you to come to a birthday dinner on August 14th, as a friend. Miles Donovan studied my face for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and wrote the date in his calendar. As a friend, he said, until you need me to be something else. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked back out into the April afternoon. On Lexington Avenue, the lunch crowd was thinning taxis, moving uptown in the particular impatient way of New York traffic, a street vendor selling coffee from a silver cart on the corner. I bought a cup, stood on the sidewalk, and drank it slowly. Clara called while I was standing there. Dad, she said, did you really put Preston's name on the contract? I looked up at the building I had just left. Yes, I said. Why? I watched a cab cut across 2 lanes of traffic without signaling the way they always did, the way they always would. Because I still hoped I was wrong about him, I said. I wanted to give him one last chance to be the person I raised. Clara was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone with nothing to say, but the quiet of someone choosing carefully. Okay, Dad, she said finally. I hope you're right. Her voice told me she did not believe I was. She was not wrong. The first email Vanessa sent to the Meridian arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May. Scott Harper forwarded it to me within the hour, the way we had agreed, with no editorial comment, just the subject line, Event Enhancement Request, and 11 paragraphs of Vanessa's specific vision for an evening she had not paid for. I read it at my kitchen table, with my second cup of coffee. She wanted to replace the approved floral arrangement with imported orchids flown in from Hawaii. She wanted to add a raw bar featuring Alaskan king crab, which she described as non-negotiable for a celebration of this caliber. She wanted 6 additional guests, 4 of them listed by their Instagram handles rather than their legal names. She wanted a dedicated live stream setup installed in the northwest corner of the room, with professional lighting equipment and a branded backdrop she would supply herself. And at the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, she had written, "Please also remove Arthur Calloway from the speaker schedule and any printed materials. He prefers to stay in the background. My name is Raymond, not Arthur." She had not bothered to learn it correctly in 6 years. I set the email down and looked out the window at the street below. A woman was walking a terrier that kept stopping to investigate every crack in the sidewalk with the focused dedication of a small scientist. I watched them for a moment. Then I called Scott. "Decline everything," I said. "Original menu, original flowers, original speaker list. If she sends more, decline those too." "Already noted, Mr. Calloway," Scott said. "There have been 3 follow-up emails since this morning. By the end of that week, there were 11. I read every one. Each successive email was slightly more insistent than the last, the language escalating from "I would love to discuss" to "I expect this to be accommodated" to, in the final message, "I hope you understand who you are dealing with." Scott declined each request with the same brief professional courtesy and copied me on every exchange. I saved them all in a folder on my phone labeled simply August. It was Frank who first told me about the money. My brother called on a Thursday evening in early June, his voice carrying that particular controlled steadiness he used when something had made him genuinely angry, but he had decided to stay calm about it. Frank had retired from 30 years as a high school principal in Westchester, and he had developed over those decades an exceptional ability to deliver bad news without losing his composure. It was one of the things I had always admired about him. "Ray," he said, "I got a message from Vanessa this afternoon. She says she's covering most of the birthday party herself out of her own pocket, and she's asking if I'd like to contribute to the cost. $500. She says every little bit helps. I put my hand flat on the kitchen table. The wood was cool under my palm, solid real. What did you tell her? I asked. I didn't tell her anything yet, Frank said. I called you first. He paused. Ray, how many people do you think she sent that message to? I thought about the family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, Margaret's side, my side. At least a dozen, I said. That's what I figured. Another pause longer this time. I'm going to screenshot this and save it. And I'm going to ask Brenda to take a look at the family credit accounts. Brenda was Frank's wife, a retired family law attorney who had spent 25 years in courtrooms and had the organized, evidence-minded habits that profession instilled in a person permanently. She did not dramatize. She documented. If Frank was the person who noticed something was wrong, Brenda was the person who could prove it. Tell Brenda thank you, I said. Tell her yourself, Frank said. She's already pulling the statements. What Brenda found over the following 2 weeks was laid out in 14 pages of credit card statements. The monthly billing records for the supplemental card I had authorized Preston to use years ago for family expenses. Under the terms of that arrangement, Preston was listed as an authorized user on my account, meaning he could make purchases, but the account itself remained in my name, and I received the full statement each month. I had stopped reviewing those statements carefully about 2 years earlier, which was, I understood now, exactly when Vanessa had understood that nobody was watching. The 14 pages showed 2 years of charges, dinners at restaurants with Michelin stars, a weekend at a resort in the Hamptons, a handbag that cost more than my first car flights to cities I had not known they visited. Each of these had appeared on Vanessa's social media as gifted or partnered content. None of them had been gifted. All of them had been charged to my account. Then, in the second week of June, I received a call from my bank's fraud detection department. A customer service representative explained that a financial transaction had been flagged on my account. Someone had attempted to use a limited power of attorney document. I had signed 2 years earlier, authorizing Preston to manage certain farm-related transactions during a period when I had been recovering from a knee surgery to initiate a large transfer of funds from my personal account into a joint account held in Preston and Vanessa's names. A power of attorney is a legal document authorizing one person to act on another's behalf in financial matters, and the authorization I had signed was narrow and specific. It covered farm equipment payments and property tax installments only. The bank's compliance team had flagged the transfer attempt because the transaction fell entirely outside the scope of what I had authorized, and they had placed a hold on it pending my confirmation. I told them to reverse the hold, cancel the authorization entirely, and flag my account for any further unusual activity. Then I hung up and called Miles Donovan. Miles, I said, bring everything you have to the dinner. Miles did not ask for clarification. He had known me long enough to understand that I did not say more than I meant. I'll be there, he said, August 14th. I set the phone down and sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. The coffee had gone cold again. Outside, the city continued its business, indifferent, relentless, entirely unimpressed by the quiet unraveling of a family on the 3rd floor of a house in Queens. I thought about Preston at 12 years old walking the fence line with me on a Saturday morning, asking why the soil color changed near the eastern edge of the property. I had told him it was because of the mineral content in the groundwater. He had thought about that for almost a full minute, and then said very seriously, "So the land remembers what went through it." Yes, I had said, the land always remembers. I stood up, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and rinsed the cup. August 14th was 7 weeks away. 7 weeks passed. The way the weeks before a hard thing always passed too slowly. At first, then all at once. And then suddenly, it was the evening of August 13th, and Frank was standing at my kitchen door with a folder under his arm, and Brenda was behind him, carrying a laptop bag, and Gerald Whitmore was already sitting at my kitchen table drinking the coffee I had put on 20 minutes before he arrived, because I had known, without being told, that Gerald would show up early. Gerald was 68 years old and had lived 4 houses down from me for 19 years. He was the kind of neighbor who showed up with a snowblower after a blizzard, without being asked who knocked on your door during a heat wave to make sure your air conditioning was working, who had driven me to my knee surgery 2 years ago and waited 4 hours in the waiting room reading the same magazine twice rather than go home and come back. He had known me when I was still driving a truck up from Schuyler County every 3rd weekend to check on the farm, and he had listened to more of my silences than almost anyone alive. He looked up when I came into the kitchen and said, "You sleeping tonight?" "Probably not," I said. "Good," he said. "Then we've got time." Frank spread the folder open on the table. Inside were printed copies of 23 text messages, screenshots Vanessa had sent to various family members, requesting contributions to the party fund, each one slightly different in wording, but identical in strategy. My cousin Harold had received one that said Vanessa was personally funding most of the evening. My Aunt Ruth, who was 79 years old and lived on a fixed income in New Jersey, had received one that said even $50 would mean so much. Frank had cross-referenced the messages with 6 confirmed payment receipts from family members who had responded. Total collected $5,200. I sat down across from Frank and looked at the papers for a long moment. My hands were resting flat on the table, and I was aware of a pressure building behind my sternum, not anger still, but something adjacent to it, something that had been accumulating for years, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, quietly and steadily, until one day the water runs different. "Aunt Ruth sent $50, I said. "She did," Frank said. I breathed through my nose slowly, the way I used to breathe when a piece of equipment broke down during harvest, and I had 20 minutes to fix it or lose the day. "Okay," I said. "What else?" Brenda opened the laptop. The 14 pages of credit card statements were organized into a single spreadsheet she had built herself, color-coded by category, with a column for dates, a column for amounts, and a column she had labeled Social Media Claim that showed where applicable what Vanessa had posted publicly about each purchase. The spreadsheet was the kind of document that a person could hand to a room full of strangers and have them understand everything within 60 seconds. Brenda had been a family law attorney for 25 years. She knew exactly how to build a document that left no room for misinterpretation. "The total unauthorized spend over 26 months, Brenda said, is $41,300 and change." She said it the way she would have said it in a courtroom, clearly without inflection, giving the number room to land on its own. Gerald let out a long, slow breath through his teeth. He did not swear. He just set down his coffee cup and looked at me. "Ray," he said. "I know," I said. "No." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped into the register it got when he was saying something he needed me to actually hear. "I mean, I know you, Ray. I've known you going on 20 years, and I know that right now you're sitting there thinking about whether it's the right thing to do, whether you're being fair, whether there's some version of this where nobody has to get hurt." He paused. "There isn't. You know there isn't." I looked at him. Gerald had the face of a man who had worked outdoors for most of his life, weathered honest, the kind of face that had no practice at deception and therefore no talent for it. He was right. I had been sitting there running the calculation he had just described, the one I had been running for years, The one that always ended with me deciding that patience was the more generous choice. "Tomorrow night," Gerald said, "you walk in there in that old suit, and you hold your head up like the man who paid for every inch of that room. Because you did. And whatever happens, you don't apologize for it." From the hallway came the soft sound of wheels on hardwood. Dorothy appeared in the kitchen doorway in her wheelchair, pushed by Clara, who had arrived an hour earlier and had been quiet in the way she was quiet when she was paying close attention to everything. Dorothy looked around the table, at Frank's folder, at Brenda's laptop, at Gerald's coffee cup, at my face, with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had been reading rooms for 83 years and was still very good at it. "Is it ready?" Dorothy asked. "Yes, Mom," I said. "I think it is." She nodded once with the finality of someone closing a book they had been reading for a long time. "Good," she said. "It is long overdue." Clara squeezed my shoulder from behind one firm, brief pressure, the kind that said everything she did not put into words. I reached up and covered her hand with mine for a moment. Her fingers were cold, the way they always got when she was anxious, and I held them until I felt some of the tension go out of them. "Nadia's coming tomorrow," I asked. "She'll be there at 6:30, Clara said. "Camera's charged. She knows what to do." Frank closed the folder. Brenda shut the laptop. Gerald drained the last of his coffee and stood up to put the cup in the sink, the way he always did, the way a man does when he has been raised to leave a kitchen, the way he found it. We sat together in this quiet kitchen for another hour, talking about things that had nothing to do with tomorrow, about the summer heat, about Gerald's garden, about a book Dorothy had been reading about Clara's new apartment in Brooklyn, with the window that stuck. The kind of talking people do when they are trying to hold something ordinary around themselves before an extraordinary thing arrives. At 10 o'clock they left. I stood on the front step and watched their cars pull away, and then I went inside and laid the old suit out on the back of the chair in my bedroom, and I looked at it for a long time before I turned off the light. I had not slept well, but I had slept 2 hours somewhere between 3 and 5 in the morning. The flat, dreamless kind of sleep that a body takes when it has decided that rest is more useful than worry. The party did not begin until 7. I wanted to be there first. The August heat had not broken. The sidewalk gave it back, doubled rising through the soles of my shoes, and by the time I had walked 6 blocks, I had already loosened my tie by half an inch. New York in August was not a city that made concessions to comfort, which was something I had always privately respected about it. It did not pretend the heat was not there. It simply continued. The Meridian's lobby was cool and quiet. The doorman held the door without comment. I crossed the marble floor to the elevator bank and rode up alone 42 floors of silence, watching the numbers climb. When the doors opened, Scott Harper was already there, standing just outside the elevator, with his hands clasped in front of him, and his expression exactly as composed as it had been the first day I met him. "Mr. Calloway," he said, extending his hand, "welcome back." The private dining room was transformed. The afternoon light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows at a long angle, catching the white and yellow flowers on each table and turning them briefly gold. The linens were pressed and set. The glassware was polished to the point of near invisibility. At the far end of the room, near the windows, a small lectern had been placed on a low platform, the spot where the evening's remarks would be made. On the welcome board by the entrance in clean gold lettering were the words, "An evening curated by Vanessa Calloway." I looked at it for a moment. Scott was watching me carefully, the way a person watches someone open news they have been bracing for. I felt something move through my chest, not rage, which would have been simpler, but a kind of exhausted recognition. This was who she was. This was the full and complete expression of it, rendered in gold letters on a board at the entrance to a room I had paid $15,000 for. "Scott," I said. "Yes, Mr. Calloway." Leave it. He paused. Sir, leave the board as it is. I turned away from it and walked toward the window. The city spread below us in every direction, midtown Manhattan. On an August evening, the light going amber and long. Across the rooftops, the traffic, 42 floors down, reduced to something almost musical. Let it stay exactly as she arranged it. I want everyone to see it when they walk in. Scott was quiet for a moment, then understood. He walked me through the final invoice, $15,040, inclusive of service and tax, consistent with what we had agreed in April. I signed the authorization and handed it back. My hand was steady. I had expected it not to be. Same instruction as before, I said. My name stays out of it until I give you the signal. Yes, sir. He folded the invoice into the leather folio and tucked it under his arm. Is there anything else you need before guests arrive? Just one thing. If anyone attempts to make changes tonight to the setup, to the speaker order, to anything in this room, you decline and you document. Scott nodded with the gravity of a man who had heard enough between the lines to understand the complete sentence. Already noted, Mr. Calloway. Clara arrived at 6:15 with Nadia Osei, whom I had not met in person until that moment. Nadia was perhaps 34, with a calm, observant quality that I recognized immediately. She was the kind of person who watched a room the way Clara watched a room, taking in more than she let on. She shook my hand and said simply, Clara's told me a lot about you, Mr. Calloway. It's good to finally meet you. She told me to bring a camera, Nadia said. So I brought one. She held up her phone, not a professional device, just her own phone, but held with the deliberateness of someone who intended to use it carefully. I'll stay out of the way. You're here as Clara's guest, I told her. If anyone asks you help with the technical side of things. Nadia glanced at Vanessa's live stream equipment, already set up in the northwest corner. The ring light, the branded backdrop, the small monitor on a stand. She looked back at me with an expression that suggested she found the situation both clarifying and unsurprising. Got it, she said. Gerald arrived at 6:20 and walked straight to me without stopping to look at the room. He put his hand on my shoulder, gripped it once, and said, You good, Ray? I told him I was. He studied my face for a second, decided I was telling the truth, and went to find a seat with a clear view of the door. Frank and Brenda arrived together at 6:30, Brenda with her laptop bag, and the particular straightness of spine she always carried into a room where she expected to be useful. Dorothy's transport arrived at 6:45, a wheelchair-accessible van from the senior living facility where she had been staying through the summer for a physical therapy program. 2 attendants helped her into the room, and she directed them to position her chair at the end of the table nearest the windows, facing the entrance, so she could see everyone who came in. Miles Donovan arrived at 6:50 in a gray suit, no briefcase, looking entirely like a man attending a birthday dinner. He found me near the bar. Cart shook my hand and said quietly, Everything's in my jacket pocket. I won't need to reach for it unless you give me the word. You'll know when, I said. By 5 minutes to 7, perhaps 30 guests had filled the room. The noise level had risen to the comfortable pitch of a gathering where people are glad to see one another. Overlapping conversations, the clink of glasses, someone laughing too loudly near the window. The flowers caught the early evening light. The city glowed below us. One of Margaret's cousins approached me near the entrance and said, gesturing at the welcome board, Is this the party Vanessa put together? She mentioned she'd been working on it for months. I looked at the gold letters on the board. Gerald from across the room had heard the question and was watching me with careful eyes. It's a beautiful room, I said. I'm glad everyone could come. The cousin smiled and moved on. Gerald raised his coffee cup at me from across the room, a small private salute. I nodded back. Then the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened with a soft chime, and I heard Vanessa's voice before I saw her, bright and carrying, already performing for an audience that had not yet assembled itself around her. She walked in wearing white, and the room shifted toward her, the way rooms shifted toward people who had spent years training them to do exactly that. She came through the entrance the way a weather system comes in off the ocean. You felt the pressure change before you saw the clouds. Vanessa had Preston 2 steps behind her, which was where Preston had been for most of their marriage, and she was already talking before she had fully cleared the doorway. Her voice pitched at the particular frequency that filled a room without appearing to try. "Oh, this is gorgeous," she said, turning slowly to take in the space, one hand pressed to her collarbone, in a gesture of delight that I had seen her rehearse without knowing she was rehearsing on at least a dozen social media videos. "I am so proud of how this came together. This is exactly what I envisioned." Preston was wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment had in the 90s. He looked good, the way Preston always looked good, tailored, effortless. The product of money spent on appearing not to have thought about money. He scanned the room when he entered, and his eyes found me at the far end near the windows. For a fraction of a second, something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, but its younger cousin, the thing that lives just before guilt, and sometimes never matures into it. Then Vanessa touched his arm, redirecting him toward Margaret, and his expression reset. Margaret had arrived 20 minutes earlier. She was wearing a deep blue dress, and her good earrings the same ones she had put on the first night Vanessa came to dinner. She rose when Vanessa entered and opened her arms, and Vanessa walked into them with the practiced ease of a woman who had long understood that Margaret's affection was the most useful currency in this family. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, "you have outdone yourself." "I just wanted it to be perfect for Dad," Vanessa said, loud enough for the nearest 8 people to hear. I was standing 12 feet away. Neither of them looked at me. Vanessa moved through the room with the efficiency of a person executing a plan she had been refining for weeks. She greeted relatives by name, touched elbows, laughed at the right moments, steered conversations with the invisible hand of someone who had spent years understanding that the person who controls the narrative controls the room. Within 10 minutes of arriving, she had spoken to nearly every guest. Within 15, she had positioned herself in front of her live stream setup in the northwest corner and was adjusting the ring light with the focused attention of a surgeon. "We are live in 5, she announced to no one in particular, and to everyone simultaneously. Preston drifted to the bar. He ordered a bourbon and stood with his back to the live stream equipment, watching the room with the expression of a man who has learned that the easiest way to avoid accountability is to stay slightly out of frame. It was the place cards that broke first. The tables had been set by Scott's staff according to the original seating arrangement, which placed me at the head of the central table, the host's position, as Scott and I had discussed. I had not made a point of it. I had simply assumed it would remain as arranged. Vanessa noticed the cards during her first pass through the room. I watched her stop, pick up my place card between 2 fingers, read it, and set it back down. With a small, thoughtful pause, the pause of someone making a calculation. Then she picked it up again, walked to the far end of the table and placed it in the corner seat, with its back to the room and its side to the window, the seat that would be furthest from her live stream frame, and most obscured by the floral centerpiece. She returned to the head of the table and placed her own card where mine had been. Gerald had seen it. He was on his feet before I could gesture, his jaw set, his coffee cup already put down on the nearest surface, with a firmness that made the woman beside him look up. I shook my head at him once clearly. He stopped. He looked at me with an expression that said this cost him something, then sat back down with deliberate slowness. I walked to the far end of the table and sat down in the corner seat. The centerpiece was, in fact, directly in my sightline to the head of the table. I could see Vanessa settling into my chair with the satisfaction of someone who believes that possession is the entirety of the argument. I picked up the water glass in front of me and drank from it. Across the table, Dorothy was watching Vanessa with an expression I recognized from my childhood, the expression she wore when she had already reached a conclusion and was simply waiting for the evidence to finish arriving. The first course came out at 7:30. Vanessa narrated it on her live stream. The presentation, the ingredients, the exquisite attention to detail she had personally requested. Preston ate without speaking. Margaret laughed at something a cousin said and touched Vanessa's arm twice in 10 minutes. The room was warm and loud, and to any outside observer entirely festive. I ate my soup and listened to Vanessa accept compliments that belonged to a room I had paid for, a menu I had approved, flowers I had selected, and an evening I had designed down to the transportation that had brought Dorothy from the senior living facility. I listened, and I did not correct the record. I had decided sometime in the weeks between April and August that the truth did not need me to announce it. The truth only needed the right moment. The main course arrived at 8:15. I watched the serving staff move through the room, placing dishes with quiet precision. Clara was seated 3 chairs to my left. She caught my eye briefly, and the look she gave me was not a question, it was a statement. She was ready. Across the room, Nadia adjusted her position slightly, the phone in her hand angled with the casual deliberateness of someone who had decided exactly what she needed to capture. Vanessa's livestream viewer count visible on the monitor beside her setup read 8,400. The dish was set in front of me. I reached for the serving spoon. It was a habit I had carried for 30 years, serving Clara before myself at any family meal. When she was small, she used to hold her plate out with both hands very seriously, the way children hold things they consider important. She had stopped doing that when she was about 9, but I had never stopped reaching for her plate first. It was not something I thought about. It was simply what I did. My hand closed around the handle of the serving spoon. The dish in front of me was braised short rib, the kind of thing that smelled like a winter Sunday, rich and slow cooked, the kind of smell that belongs to kitchens where people are comfortable with each other. Vanessa's voice came from the far side of the table, amplified by the open microphone on her live stream setup. "Sir?" The word landed like a door closing. "Can you not?" I looked up. She had the camera angled directly at me. The ring light behind it turned her into something bright and shadowless, and her expression was the expression of someone who had decided that this moment, this specific public moment, was the one she had been waiting for. Her voice was measured, deliberate, each word given its full weight, so that the 8,000 people watching could hear every syllable. "You are getting your hands all over the food," she said. "This dinner cost more than you have earned in the last 5 years, and honestly, you look like you wandered in from a bus stop. Nobody invited the help to touch the plates." The room stopped. Not gradually, the way conversations wind down when something interesting happens. All at once, completely, as though someone had cut the power to every sound in the space simultaneously. A woman near the window had been laughing at something, and the laugh ended mid-note and did not resume. A man reaching for his wine glass left his hand suspended in the air. The servers near the kitchen door went very still. 8,400 people watched it happen in real time. Clara was on her feet before the last word had fully left Vanessa's mouth. Her chair scraped back hard against the floor, and her face had gone the particular white. It went when she was beyond anger into something colder and more absolute. I turned to her and I shook my head once firmly, the way I had shaken it at Gerald an hour earlier. The way a man shakes his head when he needs the people who love him to trust him for just a little longer. Clara sat back down. Her hands were flat on the table and trembling. Preston put down his fork. He looked at Vanessa, then at me, then at his plate. Then he picked the fork back up and said without raising his eyes, "She's right, Dad. You're embarrassing us." I looked at my son. I took the full measure of that sentence, its specific weight, its exact shape, the way it fit against every memory I had of the boy who had walked fence lines with me and asked about soil composition and run to me with a bloody knee and fallen asleep in the truck on the way home from county fairs. I held the sentence up against all of those memories, and I understood with a finality that did not hurt the way I had expected it to hurt, that I was not going to get any of those versions of Preston back tonight. Perhaps not ever. Margaret had her wine glass halfway to her lips. She did not bring it the rest of the way. She looked at Vanessa and she nodded. It was a small movement, barely a degree of tilt, the kind of nod that is not really agreement, but is so close to it as to make no practical difference. Then she looked down at her plate and began cutting her food, as though the table were a place where nothing in particular was happening. Gerald's face had gone dark red. His jaw was working the way it did when he was holding something in by force of will alone, and his hands were pressed flat on the table with a pressure that had turned his knuckles white. He was looking at me with an expression that was equal parts fury and anguish, the expression of a man watching a wrong thing happen to someone he loves and being asked to wait. Dorothy had not moved. She sat at the end of the table nearest the windows, her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at Vanessa with an expression I had not seen on her face since the day a farm supply salesman had driven out to the property in 1978 and tried to convince her to sell the eastern acreage to a developer at below market value. She had been quiet that day, too. She had listened to everything he said, and then she had told him to get off her land, and when he had tried to argue, she had walked back inside the house and called the county sheriff's office. She had not raised her voice once. She was that quiet now. Nadia had not moved either. She was in the corner near the window, half visible behind a cluster of standing guests, and her phone was held at the level of her hip, angled upward, capturing everything. I set the serving spoon down on the edge of the dish. I did not drop it. I did not slam it. I placed it with the same care I would have used setting down any tool at the end of a job, deliberately, without drama, in a way that said the work here was finished. I pushed my chair back from the table. The legs did not scrape. I had been careful about that. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and looked at Vanessa across the length of the table. She had the expression of someone who had expected either an argument or a retreat, and was not yet certain which she was getting. I looked at Preston. He was still looking at his plate. I looked at Margaret. She had resumed cutting her food. Then I reached down and offered my hand to Clara. She took it, her fingers still trembling, still cold, and she stood up beside me. "Dad," she said barely above a whisper, "are you sure?" "Yes," I said. We walked toward the door together. The room parted around us the way rooms part around people who have somewhere definite to be. I did not look back to see who was watching. I did not turn around to see Vanessa's face or Preston's posture, or whether Margaret had finally looked up from her plate. I had spent 40 years looking back to see if anyone was following. Tonight, I walked straight ahead. The elevator doors closed behind us, and the noise of the dining room disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. Clara was still holding my hand. Her grip had not loosened since I had offered it to her at the table, and I could feel the tremor still working through her fingers, not the fine surface tremor of cold, but something deeper, the kind that comes from holding a great deal of emotion in a body not quite large enough to contain it comfortably. I did not say anything to her while we descended. I simply held her hand and let the numbers above the doors count down in silence. The lobby of the Meridian was all cream marble and low amber light, the kind of space designed to make a person feel that the world outside was a manageable distance away. A pianist somewhere to the left was playing something slow and undemanding. Two couples were seated near the entrance on low chairs, talking quietly over drinks. A man in a dark coat was checking out at the front desk. Everything moved at the pace of a place that had decided architecturally that urgency was someone else's problem. Clara pulled her hand from mine the moment we cleared the elevator. She turned to face me, and her eyes were bright, with the particular brightness that precedes tears without necessarily becoming them. "Dad." Her voice came out lower than she had intended. "Tell me you have a plan." "I have a plan," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, the look she had given me since she was a child, whenever she was deciding whether to believe something I had told her. When she was 7, it had taken her approximately 4 seconds to decide I was telling the truth about most things. That instinct had never entirely left her. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She pressed both hands briefly over her face, took one long breath through her nose, and lowered them. Her jaw was set. Her shoulders came back. She was, I thought, the bravest person I knew, and the one who most consistently failed to realize it. I found Scott Harper at the concierge station, near the corridor that led back to the private dining rooms. He was reviewing something on a tablet, and he looked up when he heard my footsteps with the alert composure of someone who had been expecting me for the past 45 minutes. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "has the final charge been processed?" I asked. "Not yet, sir. Per your original instructions, the card authorization converts after dessert is served." He paused. "Dessert has not yet been served." I nodded. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. The banking application took 4 seconds to open, 4 seconds, during which I was aware of the pianist still playing in the other room, of Clara standing 2 feet behind me, of the soft footfall of a server crossing the lobby, with a tray of the enormous and ordinary continuity of the world, proceeding around the specific gravity of this moment. I navigated to the account. I located the payment authorization I had established for the Meridian, a pre-approved instruction to the bank to release $15,040 to the restaurant upon confirmation of service completion. Revoking it required 2 steps, a confirmation screen, and a 4-digit code I had memorized in April for exactly this purpose. I entered the code. The screen showed a brief processing indicator. Then authorization revoked. No funds will be transferred from this account for this merchant. I put the phone back in my pocket. "Scott," I said, "the authorization has been removed. The outstanding balance is now due directly from the party." Scott Harper did not blink. He did not look surprised or uncomfortable or uncertain about what was being asked of him. He looked like a man who had run a private dining room for 15 years and had in that time seen enough of the complexity of family gatherings to be prepared for most of what families were capable of. "I understand, Mr. Calloway," he said. "I'll bring the folio to the table." "Please tell them exactly what happened," I said. "Don't soften it. The payment authorization was removed by the account holder, and the balance of $15,040 is due before the party concludes." "Of course." He paused for a moment, the pause of a man who has something else to say and is deciding whether to say it. "Is there anything else I should have ready?" "The contract," I said. "The original signed agreement, the deposit receipt, all email correspondence you've received from anyone other than me regarding this reservation. Have it accessible." "It's already on my tablet," Scott said. "It has been since this afternoon." I looked at him. There was something in his expression, not satisfaction, which would have been inappropriate, but a kind of quiet alignment, the look of a person who has been asked to do something that corresponds precisely with their own sense of how things ought to be handled. "Thank you, Scott," I said, "for all of it, from the beginning." He nodded once with the brevity of a man who understood that the moment did not require more than that. Then he straightened his jacket, picked up the leather folio from the station beside him, and walked back down the corridor toward the private dining room with the unhurried, purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly what they were walking into and had decided to walk into it well. Clara appeared at my elbow. She had been listening to the entire exchange, and her trembling had stopped, replaced by a stillness that I recognized as the other side of her anxiety, the part that kicked in when something was actually happening, and there was no longer any use in dreading it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait," I said. We moved to a pair of chairs near the lobby windows. Outside, Midtown Manhattan continued its business with the magnificent indifference of a city that had witnessed every variety of human drama and remained through all of it fundamentally unimpressed. Cabs moved uptown. A couple walked past the window arguing cheerfully about something, gesturing with their hands. A delivery driver locked his bike to a post with the efficient speed of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Clara sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, the way Dorothy's back was always straight. She did not speak. Neither did I. There was nothing left to arrange, nothing left to prepare, nothing left to decide. Then from somewhere above us, on the 42nd floor, the lights went out. Not all the lights, just the special event, lighting the warm amber wash that the Meridian used for private celebrations, the kind installed specifically to make an evening feel like something. One moment it had been on. The next, it was not. The difference was visible even from the lobby, a subtle shift in the quality of light at the top of the elevator bank indicator. Clara turned to look at me. "That's the authorization cutoff," I said. "When the payment method is removed, the premium event services disengage automatically. Scott mentioned it in April." I paused. "Vanessa's live stream just went dark." Clara looked at the elevator indicator for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, not pleasure exactly, but the specific relief of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been told it is safe to exhale. "Dad," she said quietly, "how long did you plan this?" "Since January," I said. She reached over and took my hand again. This time her fingers were warm. "Before I reveal the exact moment the tables turned and the masks finally fell, please comment, 'Still here,' to let me know you're following Raymond's journey. And a quick heads up, the upcoming part contains dramatic fictionalized elements tailored for entertainment. If you prefer not to listen further, you are welcome to turn off the video right now." I had not planned to watch. When Scott walked back down the corridor toward the private dining room, I had fully intended to remain in my chair, near the lobby windows, with Clara beside me facing Midtown Manhattan, listening to the pianist play something I could not quite identify. I had told myself that I did not need to see it happen. The thing was already in motion. Whether I watched or not would not change what was coming. But Clara stood up. She did not say anything. She simply rose from her chair, crossed the lobby to the glass partition that separated the corridor from the main reception area, and stood there with her arms folded across her chest, watching. I sat where I was for approximately 15 seconds. Then I stood up and went to stand beside her. Through the glass we could see the entrance to the private dining room, not the full interior, but the section near the door, and through that, at an angle, a portion of the central table where Vanessa had been seated. The room was still dim from the loss of the event lighting, compensated now by the restaurant's standard overhead fixtures, which gave everything a flatter, more ordinary quality. The kind of light in which things look exactly as they are without enhancement. Scott Harper entered the dining room carrying the black leather folio with both hands. I watched him cross to the table. He moved without hurry, without apology, with the particular bearing of a man who understood that the dignity of what he was about to do depended entirely on the manner in which he did it. He reached Vanessa's position at the head of the table and set the folio down in front of her with a quiet precision that gave the gesture more weight than any dramatic placement could have. "Ma'am?" I heard him say. Or rather, I read his lips through the glass, and the word was confirmed by the sudden change in the room's atmosphere, which was visible even from where we stood. "The payment authorization for this event has been withdrawn. The outstanding balance is $15,040 due before the conclusion of the evening." Vanessa stared at this folio the way a person stares at something they have been told does not exist. Then she laughed, a short, bright, dismissive sound that carried the full confidence of someone who believes the situation is a misunderstanding that will resolve itself in the next 30 seconds. She opened her purse, removed a black credit card with the unhesitating speed of a person accustomed to using it, and handed it to Scott, with a small flourishing extension of her wrist that communicated without words that this was a minor administrative inconvenience and that everyone should relax. Scott walked the card to the portable terminal near the service station. Clara and I watched him process it. The terminal beeped once the single, flat, definitive tone of a declined transaction. Scott looked at the screen. He tried again, entering the information manually, this time the way staff do when they are giving a card every possible opportunity to work. The terminal beeped again. The same tone, the same result. He returned to the table and leaned toward Vanessa with the low-voiced discretion of someone delivering news they would prefer not to broadcast. Whatever he said, Vanessa's response was immediate and audible even through the glass partition. "That is not possible," she said. Her voice had lost its earlier brightness and found something harder underneath. "Run it again. There is money in that account." "I've attempted the transaction twice, ma'am," Scott said. "The card has been declined on both attempts. Do you have an alternate form of payment?" Vanessa's hand went back into her purse. She produced a second card, a different color, a different network, and extended it with slightly less confidence than the first. Scott processed it with the same careful thoroughness. The terminal produced the same flat beep, the same decline. He returned the card without comment. The room had gone the particular quiet that descends on a gathering when something has happened that everyone present understands, but no one has yet said aloud. Conversations had stopped. Forks had been set down. A woman near the window had turned fully in her chair to watch. The servers near the kitchen door stood very still, the way staff stands when they have been trained to be invisible, but cannot quite manage it in a moment this large. Preston shoved his chair back from the table. The legs shrieked against the floor. "This is a mistake," he said loudly enough that the words reached us clearly through the glass. "This is some kind of system error. My wife's accounts are fully funded." "I understand your concern, sir," Scott said, his voice carrying the unshakable patience of someone who had made his decision before he walked into the room and was not going to be moved from it. "However, I am required to collect payment before the party concludes. The balance of $15,040 remains outstanding." Margaret had both hands pressed flat on the tablecloth. Her face had gone the color of the cream linen beneath her palms, and she was looking at Vanessa with an expression I had not seen her direct at her daughter-in-law before, not anger, not yet, but the beginning of something that fear produces when it starts to understand what it has been afraid of all along. "Vanessa," she said. Her voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. "What is happening?" Vanessa's jaw tightened. She turned to Scott with the expression of someone recalibrating their entire approach in real time. "I want to speak to the manager," she said. "I am the manager, ma'am," Scott said. A cousin at the far end of the table said quietly, but not quietly enough, "I thought Vanessa paid for all of this." The woman beside him turned to look at him. "She told me she organized the whole thing," she said back. A murmur moved through the table, low and spreading the sound of a room full of people simultaneously revising something they believed. Then Frank slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Clara's hand found my arm. Her grip was tight, her fingers pressing into the fabric of my old suit sleeve, and she was leaning slightly forward, the way she used to lean forward as a child when something important was about to happen, and she did not want to miss a single moment of it. "Dad," she breathed. "Here we go." Frank had been a high school principal for 30 years, which meant he had spent 3 decades walking into rooms where people were lying to him and saying so in a tone of voice that left no ambiguity about what he thought of it. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply stood up at his end of the table with the unhurried authority of a man who had run Monday morning assemblies for 1,000 students and knew from long experience that the most powerful thing a person can do in a disorderly room is move slowly and speak clearly. He placed his phone on the table face up. "Before this goes any further," Frank said, "I want to read something to the room." The murmuring stopped. Vanessa turned toward him with the particular alertness of someone who has just identified a new variable in a calculation they believed was settled. Preston looked up from the table for the first time in several minutes, his expression shifting from anger into something warier and less certain. Frank picked up the phone and read aloud. His voice was level, unhurried, the voice of a man reading a document rather than making an argument. "Sent to me 6 weeks ago. Quote Frank, I wanted to reach out personally because I know how much you love Raymond. I am covering most of the birthday dinner myself out of my own pocket because he deserves nothing but the best. If you feel moved to contribute $500 would be so meaningful, and every bit helps. With love, Vanessa." He set the phone back down. "I received that message," Frank said, "and so did at least 11 other people at this table tonight." For a moment nobody spoke. Then Raymond's cousin Harold, a large quiet man who worked in construction and was not given to public declarations, pulled out his own phone and held up the screen. "I got the same one," he said. "Mine asked for 300. An aunt 2 seats down opened her purse and produced her phone without a word, turning it to show the message thread. A cousin across the table did the same. Within 90 seconds, 6 phones were raised around the table, each showing a variation of the same message, the amounts differing. The wording adjusted with the personalizing precision of someone who understood that people responded better to the impression of individual attention. The total, when Frank read the confirmed figures from the notes he had kept, was $5,200, collected over 6 weeks. From relatives who believed every cent of it was going toward an evening Raymond Calloway's daughter-in-law was funding out of genuine devotion. Vanessa's face had gone through several transitions in the space of those 90 seconds. The first was disbelief, not the genuine kind, but the performed kind, the raised eyebrows and parted lips of someone buying time. The second was calculation, a visible internal reorganization, the expression of someone deciding which version of events was most defensible. The third was something she did not intend to show and could not quite prevent a flicker of something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it to be recognizable. "That money was for extras," she said. Her voice had recovered most of its composure, but not all of it. The edges were uneven in a way they had not been earlier in the evening. "Flowers, additional services, things I was coordinating separately. It was never meant to be confused with the main event costs." Scott Harper, who had remained standing near the table throughout, turned his tablet toward the nearest cluster of guests. "The floral arrangements, all service upgrades and supplementary costs for this evening are itemized in the original contract," he said. "All of them were paid in full by the account holder in April. No additional services were coordinated through this venue by anyone other than Mr. Calloway." A silence followed that sentence. Not the comfortable silence of people absorbing information, but the sharp, pressurized silence of people understanding something they cannot ununderstand. Brenda chose that moment to open her laptop. She did it without announcement, without preamble. without looking up from the screen as she turned it to face the section of the table where Vanessa was sitting. The spreadsheet she had built over the previous 2 weeks filled the screen cleanly color-coded columns, dates running down the left side, amounts in the center, and the column she had labeled social media claim running along the right edge. These are the statements for the supplemental credit card connected to Raymond's primary account, Brenda said. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone who had delivered findings in courtrooms for 25 years and understood that the most effective presentation of damaging information was one entirely free of editorial comment. 26 months of charges. The account holder is Raymond Calloway. The authorized user was Preston. She paused to let that land, then continued. The total unauthorized spend over that period is $41,312. Each of the larger purchases corresponds to a social media post in which the item or experience was described as gifted or sponsored. None of them were. All of them were charged to Raymond's account. Harold made a sound low in his throat. The aunt with the phone pressed it flat against the table as though steadying herself. Margaret's hands, still pressed to the tablecloth, had begun to tremble, a fine, continuous tremor that she seemed not to be aware of, the kind of trembling that comes from the body registering something the mind has not yet fully admitted. Preston pushed back from the table and stood up. His face was red in the uneven way faces go red when blood pressure and emotion arrive at the same time without coordination. "This is completely out of context," he said, his voice too loud for the size of the room. "Brenda, you had no right to access those statements. That is private financial information." "Raymond is the primary account holder," Brenda said, her tone unchanged. "He receives the statements. He provided them to me. There is nothing in those documents that was not already available to the person who owns the account." She closed the laptop with a soft, decisive click. "Your father has known about every charge on that statement for 2 weeks, Preston. He simply chose to let tonight be the moment it became relevant." Preston turned toward the glass partition toward the lobby, toward where he knew or sensed or felt in the way children sometimes feel the presence of a parent, even when they cannot see them, that I was standing. His face had shed the red and gone pale beneath it, a deeper and less manageable color than the anger had been. Vanessa said his name. He did not look at her. Across the table, in the chair she had positioned herself in at the start of the evening to face the entrance, Dorothy unfolded her hands from her lap and placed them on the armrests of her wheelchair. And Miles Donovan set down his dessert fork. Miles Donovan rose from his chair, the way certain men rise, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the measured deliberateness of someone who has decided that the moment has arrived and intends to meet it correctly. He was wearing a gray suit and no expression that could be read as anything other than professional composure. And when he stood, the remaining conversations at the table ceased, in the way they cease when a room senses that the person standing has something to say that is going to matter. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a thin folder, 3 or 4 pages folded once. He placed it on the table without opening it. "My name is Miles Donovan," he said. "I am an estate planning and financial attorney licensed in the state of New York. I have been Raymond Calloway's legal counsel for 20 years. I attended tonight as his guest." He paused, giving the room a moment to absorb the distinction. "I am now going to share one additional matter that has not yet been addressed." Vanessa's chin lifted. Her eyes moved from Donovan to the folder on the table and back to Donovan with the rapid calculation of someone trying to determine, in the space of 2 seconds, how much damage was coming and from which direction. Donovan unfolded the pages. He did not hand them around. He simply placed them flat on the table where they could be seen by the people nearest to him, and spoke clearly enough for the rest of the room to follow. "In March of this year," he said, "Raymond's bank received a request to execute a large financial transfer from Raymond's personal account The account into which his land compensation was deposited into a joint account held in the names of Preston and Vanessa Calloway. The request was submitted using a limited power of attorney document that Raymond had signed 2 years earlier. He looked at Preston directly. That document authorized Preston to manage specific farm-related transactions during Raymond's post-surgical recovery. It covered farm equipment payments and property tax installments, nothing else. Preston's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The bank's compliance department flagged the transfer because the transaction fell entirely outside the scope of the authorization. Donovan continued. The transfer was blocked. The bank notified Raymond directly. Raymond notified me. He closed the folder with a soft, clean movement. No funds were moved. Raymond chose not to pursue the matter through formal channels at that time. He made a different choice about when and where this information would become relevant. The room was so quiet that I could hear from the lobby the faint sound of the pianist beginning a new piece, something slow in a minor key, with the quality of music that has no idea what is happening 40 feet away and does not particularly need to. Preston sat down. Not slowly, not with any composure. He sat down the way a person sits when their legs have made a decision that the rest of their body has not yet caught up to. His face was the color of old plaster, and his hands came up to the table in front of him and pressed down hard, as though he needed something solid to confirm that the table was still there. Vanessa turned to him. "Preston!" Her voice was low and precise and carried in it something I had never heard from her before. An edge that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the fact that whatever story she had prepared for this evening, this was not in it. Preston looked at his hands on the table. He did not look at his wife. Margaret made a sound that was not a word, a short, compressed exhalation, the sound of someone who has been holding a great deal of air in their lungs and has just been given a reason to let it go all at once. She pressed one hand over her mouth. Her eyes went to Donovan, then to the folder, then to Preston, and in them was an expression I had not seen in decades, the expression she had worn the winter. Preston was 16 and had come home at 2 in the morning, smelling of something she did not want to identify, the expression full of a mother, confronting the distance between the child she raised and the person he had become. "Preston," she said. Just his name, nothing attached to it. He still did not look up. Then Dorothy spoke. She had been still since she repositioned her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair, the stillness of someone conserving something energy or patience, or the particular force that certain people carry in them and know not to spend carelessly. When she spoke, she did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In a room this quiet, a voice of ordinary volume arrives with the force of something much larger. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want everyone in this room to listen carefully, because I am 83 years old, and I have earned the right to say it once and have it heard." No one moved. The server near the kitchen door, who had been inching toward the corridor, stopped moving entirely. "That land," Dorothy said, "did not belong to Raymond alone. It belonged to everyone who ever broke their back on it. It belonged to my husband, who died on it at 61. It belonged to me, who worked it for 40 years after he was gone. It belonged to Raymond, who drove 3 hours every weekend for a decade to tend it after I could no longer do it myself." She paused, and in the pause was the full weight of everything she had not said all evening. It did not belong to anyone who sat in this room tonight and called the man who paid for every inch of it the help. She looked at Vanessa, directly, without anger, without theater. Just the level, clear-eyed look of a woman who had been reading people for 8 decades and was entirely done with this particular one. "You wore white to his birthday," Dorothy said. "In my day that meant something." Vanessa's mouth opened. For the first time all evening, perhaps for the first time in longer than that, nothing came out of it. Margaret began to cry. Not delicately, not with the contained grief of someone managing their composure in public, but with the abruptness of someone whose composure has simply given way all at once, the way a thing gives way when it has been under too much pressure for too long. She pressed both hands over her face and her shoulders shook, and no one at the table moved to touch her. And the sound she made was the sound of a woman understanding something about herself that she had been refusing to understand for a very long time. Clara's hand found my arm through the glass partition. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool surface and let out a long, slow breath. Across the room, I watched Nadia lower her phone from its recording position slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has what they came for and is now choosing how to hold it. Nadia did not post the footage. That had never been the plan. She sent it directly to Clara's phone in 2 files, the first covering the dinner from the moment Vanessa changed the place cards, the second beginning at the serving spoon, and running through Dorothy's last word. Clara texted me from the lobby, where she had stepped away to receive the files. "It's all here, Dad. Everything." I read the message and put my phone back in my pocket and looked out at Midtown Manhattan and felt more than anything else very tired, in the way that a person gets tired after a long job done, carefully, not depleted, but empty, in the particular clean way of a vessel that has finished holding something heavy. The clip that went public did not come from Nadia. A guest at the far end of the table, a second cousin of Margaret's named Walter, who had been sitting in the corner eating his dinner and saying very little all evening, had been recording on his own phone since the moment Vanessa angled the camera at Raymond. Walter was 61 years old, worked in insurance, and had no social media presence of his own. What he had was a daughter who ran a moderately followed account, dedicated to what she described as holding people accountable in real time, and when he called her from the parking garage at 9:30 and described what he had witnessed, she asked him to send the video immediately. She posted it at 10:14 in the evening. By 11 o'clock, it had been viewed 400,000 times. Clara and I were in a cab heading back to Queens when her phone began sounding notifications in rapid succession, the particular rhythm of a phone receiving more information than it was designed to absorb gracefully. She silenced it and turned to me with an expression that was neither satisfied nor distressed, but something in between the expression of a person watching a consequence arrive that they knew was coming and still find larger than expected when it actually appears. "It's everywhere," she said quietly. "What are people saying?" I asked. She looked at the screen for a moment. "Most of them are angry," she said. "A few are defending her." She paused. "The ones defending her are losing the argument pretty quickly." Back at the Meridian, the business of the evening's financial resolution was proceeding without me. Scott Harper had confirmed the details by text, brief, professional, chronological. Margaret had used money from a personal savings account to cover the largest portion of the balance. Frank had contributed the remainder rather than allow the evening to end with the bill unpaid, with the understanding, formalized by a handwritten note, Brenda witnessed and photographed, that Vanessa and Preston would repay him in full. Several relatives had applied their earlier contributions transferred back to them by Vanessa under pressure from Frank, who had made it quietly but unmistakably clear that returning that money was not optional directly to the outstanding balance. The total of $15,040 was settled at 9:52 in the evening. Gerald was the last to leave the dining room. He texted me from the elevator, "Ray, done. You all right?" I wrote back, "Yes. Thank you, Gerald." He replied with a single period, which was Gerald's way of saying that no further acknowledgement was necessary, and that he intended to be at my kitchen table with coffee on Saturday morning, regardless of anything else that happened between now and then. By midnight, Vanessa had lost 3 brand partnerships. The notifications arrived in her email as automatic system messages, the kind generated when a company's social monitoring software detects a viral controversy attached to an influencer's name and triggers the contractual termination clause that most brand agreements contain for exactly this circumstance. A skincare company, a meal kit delivery service, a home goods retailer whose entire brand identity was built around the concept of family warmth. By 2 in the morning, a fourth had followed. Preston called me at 11:47. I was sitting in my kitchen with the lights low, drinking water, not ready for sleep, but not fighting it either, simply occupying the quiet of my own home in the particular way that becomes possible after a long thing is finally over. I looked at his name on the screen for 4 rings. Then I answered, "Dad." His voice was rough, in the way voices get rough when a person has been crying or is very close to it, and the word came out with a weight it did not usually carry, not the easy, habitual dad of someone who expects to be received, but the tentative, searching version of it, the one that knows it might not be. "Preston," I said. A pause. Outside my window, a bus went past its lights, moving across the ceiling of the kitchen in a slow, even sweep. "I don't know what to say," he said finally. "I don't know where to start." I thought about the boy on the fence line. I thought about the question he had asked about soil color, about mineral content in groundwater, about whether the land remembers. I thought about the distance between that boy and the man on the other end of this phone call, and about how long it had taken that distance to accumulate, and about how many small moments I had let pass without speaking, because I had told myself there would be a better time. "Not tonight, Preston," I said. "Not tonight." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay." The word came out small and without argument, which was more honest than anything else he had said all evening. I stayed on the line for another few seconds, long enough to hear him breathing on the other end, the unsteady rhythm of someone trying to hold themselves together in a room that has just gotten very large and very cold. Then I said goodnight and ended the call. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The city outside was doing what it always did, moving indifferent, continuous. A siren somewhere, then gone. A dog barking twice and stopping. The refrigerator humming its low domestic note. All of it ordinary, all of it unchanged, all of it entirely unaware that anything significant had happened in a dining room on the 42nd floor of a building 12 blocks away. I thought about $15,000. I thought about $41,000. I thought about $5,200 collected from relatives, including $50 from an aunt on a fixed income in New Jersey. I thought about all of it, and then I let myself stop thinking about the money, because the money had never been the point. The point was the serving spoon. The point was the look on Clara's face when she sat back down at my signal. The point was Dorothy's voice in a quiet room. The point was the moment the truth stopped requiring my labor to stay visible. I put my glass in the sink and went to bed. I slept 4 hours and woke at 6:15 to the sound of the garbage truck on its Thursday rounds. For a moment, the brief, unguarded moment before full consciousness arrives, I did not remember what had happened the night before. Then I did all of it in the particular rush that memory uses when it has been waiting just below the surface of sleep. I lay still for a moment, taking inventory. My chest did not feel the way I had expected it to feel. I had anticipated something heavier, guilt perhaps, or the specific grief of irrevocable action. What I found instead was the same quiet I had felt in the lobby of the Meridian after I put my phone back in my pocket. Not happiness, not satisfaction in any simple sense, just the solid, undemanding presence of a thing that had been done and could not be undone and did not need to be. I got up and made coffee. Clara called at 7:45 before I had finished the first cup. Her voice was alert in the way it got when she had been awake for longer than she was admitting. "How are you, Dad?" Rested, I said, relatively. The clip has 11 million views, she said, as of 20 minutes ago. I poured more coffee into my cup, even though it was still half full. How are you? I asked. I'm okay, she said. I'm better than okay, actually. A pause. Nadia says the footage she has is clean. She's keeping it just in case, but she's not planning to do anything with it unless we need it. Tell her thank you, I said. From me, properly. After Clara, I sat at the kitchen table, with the phone face down, and worked through the morning the way I had worked through mornings for 40 years, methodically, without rushing, giving each thing the time it required. I read the newspaper. I washed the cup I had used at 11 the night before, which was still in the sink. I checked the bank account and confirmed that no further attempts had been made on the authorization. Frank had texted at 6 in the morning. All settled. Talk when you're ready. I wrote back, thank you, Frank. Saturday. He replied, coffee's on me. Preston arrived at 11:13. He did not call first. I heard the knock and knew before I opened the door who it was, not from any particular sound, but from the quality of the pause between knocks, which was the pause of someone who had rehearsed coming to this door and then stood outside it longer than they planned. He looked the way a man looks after a night that has taken something from him permanently. The expensive suit was gone. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans that needed washing, and his eyes had the particular flatness that comes after extended crying has finished and left nothing behind it but exhaustion. He had shaved, which struck me as an act of effort under the circumstances, the kind of small, disciplined thing a person does when they need to feel like they still have some control over at least one surface of their life. Dad, he said. I stepped back from the door and held it open. He came inside. We sat at the kitchen table. I put a cup of coffee in front of him, without asking whether he wanted one, because he was my son, and I had been putting coffee in front of him since he was 17 years old, and those reflexes do not dissolve overnight regardless of what happens in between. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it. He did not drink from it immediately. He just held it the way a person holds something warm, when warmth is what they most need, and they do not know how to ask for it directly. I knew some of it, he said finally. His voice was steadier than it had been on the phone the night before, but it cost him something to keep it that way. I could hear the effort in it, the deliberate management of a man trying to have a conversation he had been dreading since approximately 9 o'clock the previous evening. Not all of it. The money she was collecting from people I didn't know about that. The credit card, I knew it was happening, but I told myself it wasn't as bad as it looked. He stopped. That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. Which part didn't you know? I asked. And which part did you choose not to look at? He flinched. Not dramatically, just a small contraction around his eyes, the involuntary response of someone who has been asked precisely the question they were hoping to navigate around. He looked down at the coffee mug. Both, he said. Some of both. I got up and refilled my own cup, even though I did not particularly need more coffee. I stood at the counter for a moment with my back to him, looking out the window at the August morning. A pigeon was doing something determined on the fire escape railing. Across the street, a woman was watering the window boxes outside her second-floor apartment, with the focused attention of someone who finds the task genuinely satisfying. When you were 12, I said, still looking out the window, you asked me why the soil on the eastern edge of the property was darker than the rest. A pause behind me. I remember that, Preston said. His voice had shifted into something younger and less defended. You asked if the land remembered what went through it. I turned around and looked at him. He was watching me with an expression I had not seen on his face in many years, Not the composed, socially calibrated face he wore in rooms where he was performing a version of himself, but something underneath it, the face that existed before he learned that faces could be managed. "It does," I said. "So do I." Preston's jaw worked. He pressed his lips together and looked down and up again, the rapid, involuntary blinking of someone fighting an emotion they have decided they do not have the right to display in front of the person they have wronged. "What do I do now, Dad?" he asked. His voice broke on the last word, not dramatically, not with the release of someone who has been building to it, but with the small, unplanned crack of a man asking a question he genuinely does not know the answer to. I sat back down across from him. I looked at my son, 38 years old, hands around a coffee mug in a t-shirt that needed washing, in a kitchen where he had eaten 10,000 breakfasts and been handed 10,000 things he had not earned, and had somehow arrived at 38 without understanding what earning something actually felt like. "You figure that out yourself," I said. "That's what adults do." He nodded. The nod was slow and without argument, the nod of someone absorbing something rather than agreeing with it. We sat together for another hour. We did not resolve anything. We did not reach any conclusion that could be written down or pointed to later as the moment things changed. We talked about small things, the coffee, the heat, a water stain on the kitchen ceiling that I kept meaning to have looked at. The kind of talking that is not really about what it is about, but that serves the purpose of two people remaining in the same room together, when the alternative is one of them leaving, and neither of them is ready for that yet. At 12:30, Preston stood up to go. He carried his mug to the sink and rinsed it the way he had been taught, the way he had done in this kitchen as a child. And the gesture was so automatic and so ordinary that something in my throat tightened briefly and then released. He stopped at the door. He turned around, and his expression was the expression of a man who has prepared several things to say and has discarded all of them as insufficient. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I know that's not enough." "No," I said, "it isn't, but it's a place to start." He left. I stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed, listening to his footsteps go down the stairs, heavier going down than they had been coming up, which was the opposite of what I would have expected, and which told me something about where he was in himself that I did not yet know how to interpret. I went back to the kitchen and finished my coffee. Some distances I was learning could not be closed in a morning, but they could perhaps be acknowledged. And acknowledgement, I had found, was not nothing. It was in fact the only honest place to begin. Margaret came on a Thursday afternoon 3 days after the party without calling first. I heard the knock and recognized it immediately, not from its sound, but from its timing, the particular interval between the first knock and the second that belonged specifically to her. The rhythm of a woman who had always knocked twice and waited exactly long enough to seem patient without actually being patient. 43 years of marriage had given me a detailed and involuntary knowledge of her habits, the kind of knowledge that persists long after the circumstances that produced it have changed. I opened the door. She was wearing a blue cardigan I had given her 6 birthdays ago, and she was not carrying anything. No flowers, no food, no object that could serve as a buffer between the conversation she had come to have and the having of it. Her eyes were clear, which told me she had cried before she came, not during. She had prepared herself to be here, which I recognized as an act of effort, and chose to receive as one. "Raymond," she said, "may I come in?" I stepped back and held the door. She sat at the kitchen table, her usual chair, the one facing the window, the one she had occupied for 20 years of breakfasts and arguments and silences of every variety. I put the kettle on without asking. She watched me move around the kitchen with an expression I could not immediately name, and after a moment I identified it as the expression of someone seeing something familiar that they understand for the first time they may not have adequately valued. "I owe you an apology," she said when I sat down across from her. "I want to give it to you without asking you to make me feel better about it afterward." I waited. "I knew what Vanessa was doing," she said. "Not the money, not the extent of the financial things, I genuinely did not know those. But the credit she was taking, the way she positioned herself, the way Clara was getting smaller in the family picture every year." She stopped. Her hands were around the tea mug I had placed in front of her, and she was looking at them rather than at me. I saw it, and I let it happen, because Vanessa was loud about loving me, and Clara was quiet about it, and I rewarded the performance without asking what was behind it. That was wrong. It was wrong for a long time. "Yes," I said. "It was." She looked up. I think she had expected something more, an elaboration, a qualification, something that would give her room to navigate. I did not give her that room, not because I wanted to be unkind, but because I had learned in the 3 days since the party that the kindest thing I could do for both of us was to stop softening the outline of true things. "The night of the party," she said. Her voice was lower now and steadier, the voice of someone who has decided to say the hard part and is going to say it cleanly. "When Vanessa looked at me after she said what she said to you, I nodded. You were 12 feet away, and I nodded at her." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I have spent 3 days trying to explain that to myself, and I cannot. The only honest thing I can tell you is that I was afraid of her, and I chose my comfort over your dignity, and I knew what I was doing when I did it." The kettle had finished. I got up, poured the water, and brought her mug to the table, buying myself the 30 seconds I needed to decide how to hold what she had just said. I sat back down. "Why are you afraid of her?" I asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because she never let me forget that her approval of me was conditional," she said. "She made me feel that if I disagreed with her or sided with you or gave Clara the recognition she deserved, I would lose something. I don't know exactly what I thought I would lose." She shook her head slowly. "That sounds pathetic when I say it aloud." "It sounds human," I said. "It also doesn't change what happened." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." We drank our tea. Outside, the Thursday afternoon moved at its ordinary pace, a child on a bicycle going past a FedEx truck double parked across the street, a woman on the opposite sidewalk talking on her phone with the animated gestures of someone having a conversation that requires her whole body. "I've made an appointment with a therapist," Margaret said, "for next week. I should have done it years ago." "Yes," I said, "you should have." She absorbed that without flinching, which told me she had come here prepared to be told true things and had decided in advance not to defend herself against them. That took a kind of courage I had not expected and chose to acknowledge inwardly without announcing. "Raymond," she said, "what do you want? Not what's fair, not what makes sense on paper. What do you actually want?" I thought about the house in Westchester I had been looking at online for 3 weeks. A modest place with a wide porch and 3 oak trees in the yard, and a kitchen that faced east, so the morning light would come through while I drank my coffee. I thought about Clara's voice on the phone that morning, lighter than it had been in years. I thought about what it felt like to sit on my own front step after the lease was signed, and understand for the first time in a very long time that the space around me was entirely mine. "I want to live somewhere quiet," I said, "with Clara nearby. I want to manage my own money, my own schedule, my own mornings. I want to see you when we both choose it, not because the structure of our life requires it." I looked at her directly. "I don't want a divorce, Margaret, but I need a different arrangement than the one we've had." She was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were still around the mug, and she was looking at the table between us, with the expression of a woman doing the arithmetic of what she was being offered against what she was being asked to release. "A legal separation," she said. "Yes, with a formal agreement. Finances separated, living arrangements independent, each of us responsible for our own decisions." I paused. "Miles Donovan can draw it up. It protects you as much as it protects me." Margaret looked up. Her eyes were dry, which cost her something. I could see it costing her the deliberate maintenance of composure in a moment that was pulling in the other direction. "Is that what you really want?" she asked. "Or is it what you've decided you need?" "In this case," I said, "those are the same thing." She nodded once. Slowly, with the finality of someone closing a door, they have walked through for the last time. Not slamming it, not locking it, but closing it with the quiet care of a person who understands that some doors once properly shut stay that way. "All right, Raymond," she said. "All right." The house in Westchester had a porch. That was the first thing I noticed when the real estate agent opened the front door and stepped aside to let me through. Not the kitchen, not the layout, not the condition of the roof or the age of the water heater, all the practical things a person is supposed to evaluate when they are buying a house. The porch. Wide boards painted gray facing a yard with 3 oak trees that had been there long enough to have opinions about the neighborhood. I walked out onto it before I had seen the rest of the house and stood there for a moment, and I knew. I closed on the property in mid-September. Clara moved her things into the smaller bedroom 2 weeks later, filling the windowsill with the small terracotta pots she carried everywhere. Rosemary basil, one stubborn oregano that had survived 3 apartments and showed no signs of stopping. She hung her coat on the hook by the door. She put her coffee mug on the left side of the cabinet, which was where she had always put it, and within 4 days the house had the quality of a place that 2 people actually lived in rather than occupied. I planted tomatoes along the south fence in late September, knowing they would not produce anything before the first frost. I planted them anyway. Some things you do for next year. The separation agreement was signed in the first week of October. Miles Donovan handled the paperwork with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything. Margaret signed without requesting changes, which told me she had read it carefully and decided that the terms were fair or that the fairness of the terms was less important to her than the completion of the thing. Either way, I received my copy by mail on a Thursday and filed it in the cabinet in the hallway, and did not think about it again for several days. Gerald came for coffee on the first Saturday as promised, and on every subsequent Saturday. He would arrive at 8:30, let himself in with the key I had given him, and have the coffee going before I came downstairs. We would sit on the porch with our cups and talk about things that had nothing to do with August 14th, his garden, the Yankees, a book he was reading about the history of the Erie Canal that he described as unexpectedly fascinating. The ordinary, durable texture of a friendship that had never needed drama to sustain itself. Frank and Brenda came for dinner every other Sunday. Dorothy visited once in October, her transport van pulling carefully into the driveway while Clara held the door. Dorothy was pushed up the porch ramp Frank had installed on a Wednesday afternoon without being asked, and she sat in the chair facing the oak trees and looked at the yard for a long time without speaking, and then said, "Raymond, this is right," with the tone of someone issuing a verdict rather than offering an opinion. I told her it felt that way. Across the borough, Preston and Vanessa were navigating the particular consequences of a life built on a foundation that had been removed. They lost the Upper East Side apartment in October. The rent had always been structured around resources that were no longer available, and without those resources, the arithmetic did not work. They moved to a smaller place in Brooklyn that Preston had found himself without Vanessa's input, which was itself a change in the architecture of their relationship that I noted without commenting on. Vanessa began working for a small marketing firm in Midtown in November. It was her first salaried position. Clara mentioned it without elaboration, and I received the information the same way as a fact, not a judgment. Whatever Vanessa was learning about the distance between performing a life and building one, she was learning it without my assistance, which was exactly as it should be. Preston called every Sunday. The calls were short, at first 10 minutes, careful. The conversation of two people finding the edges of a new kind of relationship and testing them gently. By November, they were longer. By December, he was calling on Wednesdays too, sometimes just to describe something that had happened at work or to ask my opinion on something minor. I answered when he called. I did not call him first. That was the arrangement we had arrived at without discussing it, and it was for the time being the right one. Margaret and I had coffee on the third Thursday of October at a diner in Astoria that we had both always liked on neutral ground, by mutual agreement. She looked well, not recovered, not resolved, but engaged with the process of recovery in a way that was different from the avoidance she had practiced for years. She told me the therapist was useful. I told her I was glad. We talked for an hour and 15 minutes and parted without ambiguity about what we were to each other. Two people who had shared 43 years and were now carefully and with some difficulty learning to share something smaller and more honest. The scholarship fund was registered with the state of New York in early December. Miles Donovan handled the incorporation, designating it as a nonprofit entity, with a board of 3, myself, Frank, and Clara, and a mission statement that Raymond Calloway had written himself at the kitchen table in Westchester one November morning, while the coffee was going and the light was coming in from the east. The way it did at that hour, warm and very specific. The kind of light that makes a person feel that what they are doing is worth the paper they are writing it on. The Callaway Farm Scholarship. 3 awards annually, each covering full tuition for 1 academic year, available to first-generation college students from rural families in New York State. I had not told Dorothy about it. I wanted to tell her in person at the ceremony in January in front of whoever else chose to come. Clara found me on the porch one December evening, sitting with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, watching the oak trees lose the last of their leaves in the particular unhurried way of trees that have done this many times and are entirely comfortable with the process. "Dad," she said, coming to lean against the railing beside me. "What are you going to wear to the ceremony?" I looked down at my tea. I looked at the 3 oak trees. I thought about a navy suit hanging in a closet, frayed at the left cuff, worn to a retirement dinner, and a birthday party, and 20 years of occasions that had mattered. "I already know," I said. She smiled, the specific smile she had, the one that meant she understood something exactly and was choosing to leave it unspoken, because some things are better that way. The oak trees stood in the yard, bare and patient, waiting for spring, the way things wait when they have learned that waiting is simply part of the work. January in Westchester is cold and honest, the way January tends to be when it has nothing left to prove. I wore the old suit. The ceremony was held in a small rented hall 12 minutes from the house. No stage lighting, no branded backdrop, no welcome board with anyone's name in gold letters. Folding chairs, a podium, a photograph on an easel. Dorothy in 1962 standing beside the tractor, squinting into the sun, with the expression of a woman who had already decided the world was going to cooperate with her. Clara stood beside me at the podium. She did not speak. She did not need to. I talked about the farm not as a financial asset, not as a loss, but as a teacher. I talked about what land requires of a person: patience, consistency, the willingness to work without guaranteed return. Dorothy sat in the front row. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded in her lap, and when I said the farm's name aloud for the final time, She closed her eyes briefly, not from sadness, but with the expression of someone receiving something they have been waiting for long enough that the arrival is almost physical. At the back of the room, Margaret sat alone in the last row. I had not told her to come. I had not told her to stay away. She had made her own choice, which was what I had asked of her, and I received it as such. After the ceremony, Gerald found me on the front step. He sat down beside me without asking. We stayed there in the January cold, two old men with coffee going cold in their hands, not saying much. "You good, Ray?" he asked finally. I looked at the bare trees across the parking lot. The sky was the particular gray of a New York January that has decided to be exactly what it is. "Yeah," I said. "I think I finally am." This is one of those grandpa stories that I never planned to tell. For 40 years, I stayed quiet not because I was weak, but because I kept believing that patience and generosity would eventually be enough. They were not. And if this family story taught me anything, it is this: silence is not kindness. Silence is just silence. It protects no one except the people who benefit from your patience. I am not proud of how long I waited. If I could give you one piece of advice, do not wait 40 years. Do not let the people who love you loudly drown out the ones who love you quietly. Do not confuse a person's willingness to perform gratitude with actually having it. I believe God places certain moments in our lives not to punish us, but to finally show us what we were too comfortable to see on our own. That night on the 42nd floor was mine. These grandpa stories, these family story moments, they happen in every family. The question is whether you will have the courage to stop paying for rooms where you are not welcome. If this family story moved you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe quiet people deserve to be seen, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. Some of these upcoming stories contain fictional elements created for reflection and education. If that is not for you, we completely understand. Choose what serves you best. But if you are staying, we are glad you are here.